Imagine working inside one of the most heavily guarded places in Qing China. Every day, you walk into a government treasury. Inside are mountains of silver. Silver collected from taxes. Silver sent from the provinces. Silver that ultimately belongs to the emperor and the state. You can see it. You can touch it. You may spend the entire day carrying it. But you cannot take even a single piece home. Because when your shift ends, you will be searched. Not casually. Not politely. Your clothes are removed. Your body is inspected. Your hands are checked. Your mouth is checked. Even the space between your legs is examined. The Qing government knew exactly what temptation looked like. But according to several Qing-era accounts, some treasury workers eventually discovered a method so bizarre that it sounds almost impossible. They found a place the guards could not easily search, and they used their own bodies to smuggle silver out of the imperial treasury. This is the strange story of the Qing Dynasty's treasury guards, the silver they were trusted to protect, and one of the most unbelievable methods of theft ever recorded in Chinese historical literature. To understand this story, we first need to understand the treasury itself. In Imperial China, silver was not simply money sitting in people's pockets. By the Qing dynasty, silver had become one of the most important forms of payment for taxes and large transactions. The government collected enormous quantities of it. Provincial governments sent silver toward the capital. Taxes were converted into silver. And eventually, large quantities of this precious metal ended up inside government treasuries. One of the most important was the imperial treasury system in Beijing. These were not ordinary warehouses. They contained state wealth. And that created a very obvious problem. The people who were closest to the silver were also the people who had the greatest opportunity to steal it. The government could build walls. It could install locks. It could appoint officials. But at the end of the day, someone still had to move the silver. That someone was the treasury worker. To understand why this mattered, imagine what it was like to work there. Every day, you handled silver worth a fortune. You moved it. You counted it. You carried it. And you watched other workers doing exactly the same thing. The silver was everywhere. But taking it home was another matter. The Qing government understood human nature. If a man spends his entire day surrounded by silver, eventually someone is going to wonder, how much of this could I take home? So the treasury had an unusual security system. Workers entering the treasury could not simply walk inside wearing their ordinary clothes. According to accounts describing the Qing treasury system, workers were required to change clothing before entering. And when they left, they had to pass a very strict inspection. The goal was simple: make it impossible to hide silver. A silver ingot hidden inside a pocket? Impossible. There were no pockets. Silver hidden underneath clothing? Impossible. The clothing was inspected. Silver hidden beneath a belt? Impossible. The worker was checked. And according to later accounts, workers were required to expose their bodies sufficiently for officials to make sure they were not carrying anything out. One Qing-era account describes workers approaching the exit and being inspected before they were allowed to leave. The security system sounds almost absurdly thorough. But then came the problem. The human body has more hiding places than a uniform does. There is another important detail. The silver stored in government treasuries was not necessarily shaped like the coins we imagine today. Large quantities of Qing silver existed in the form of ingots. These could be large, heavy, and extremely valuable. So stealing an entire ingot was not like slipping a coin into your pocket. You had to solve two problems. First, how do you hide it? And second, how do you get it past the guards? The first problem was difficult. The second was even harder, because the guards were specifically looking for people carrying silver. And that is where the story becomes extraordinary. According to the Qing-era account known as Qing Dynasty, or unofficial records of the Qing dynasty, there was a rumor about the treasury guards that sounded so ridiculous that the author initially refused to believe it. The author wrote that he had heard from an official about treasury workers hiding silver inside their bodies. He thought the story was exaggerated. Then, he claimed, he saw it for himself. The section is literally titled, How Treasury Guards Stored Silver in the Anus. It is one of those historical passages that sounds like a joke, until you realize that the story appears in an old text. And there is more. Another Qing-era literary work, Qing Dai Gongting Yanshi, also describes treasury workers using the same basic method. According to that account, some workers could supposedly conceal multiple small silver ingots. and the story claims that the workers had to endure considerable physical discomfort to do it. Whether every detail is accurate is another question. But the fact that this story appears in Qing-era literature tells us something important. The idea of treasury workers hiding silver inside their bodies was not a modern internet invention. It was already circulating in accounts about the Qing treasury. At first, it sounds completely insane. Why would anyone risk their health, their job, their freedom, and potentially their life, just to steal a relatively small amount of silver? The answer is simple. Silver was extraordinarily valuable, and corruption could become a system. The treasury worker did not necessarily have to be the mastermind. Imagine a system where dozens of people handle government silver. A worker steals a small amount. An official looks the other way. Someone else helps transport it. Someone else receives a share. Eventually, the theft becomes part of the unofficial economy surrounding the treasury. This is where the story becomes more interesting than the bizarre hiding method itself. Because the real story isn't about anatomy. It's about incentives. According to Qing Dynasty, treasury positions could themselves be extremely valuable. The text describes corruption surrounding the appointment of treasury officials and workers. Some positions were allegedly worth enormous sums because the people who obtained them expected to profit from their access to government wealth. That creates a strange situation. Imagine paying a fortune to obtain a job. Why would anyone do that? Because the job gave you access to something worth far more. The treasury was therefore not simply a workplace. It could become a source of unofficial wealth. And once corruption becomes profitable, security measures become an arms race. The government invents a new inspection. The thieves invent a new hiding place. The government removes pockets. The thieves use the body. The government searches clothing. The thieves use containers. The government checks containers. The thieves find another trick. It becomes a game of cat and mouse. And this is another fascinating detail. The stories about the Qing treasury do not describe only one method of theft. One account also describes another trick involving a water container. Normally, guards could inspect a container by opening it and turning it upside down. If something was hidden inside, it should fall out. But during the freezing winter in Beijing, according to the story, silver could supposedly become stuck inside the container. The thieves could then remove the container without immediately revealing what was inside. Again, we should be careful. These are historical accounts and stories, not modern security reports. But they reveal something fascinating about the mentality of the people involved. The treasury was constantly creating new rules, and the people trying to steal from it were constantly searching for weaknesses in those rules. The body hiding story remains the most shocking. Imagine the scene. A worker enters the treasury. He changes into official clothing. He spends hours moving silver. Officials are nearby. Guards are watching. Eventually, the day's work ends. The worker approaches the exit. He has no pockets, no bag, no package, no visible silver. The guards inspect him. His clothes contain nothing. His hands are empty. His mouth contains nothing. He appears to be clean. And yet, according to the story, the silver is still with him, hidden where the guards are least likely to look. That is the entire logic of the trick. The security system was designed around the assumption that stolen goods would be hidden in clothing or containers. But the human body itself became the container. This is where we need to slow down. Because there is a huge difference between "this happened" and "an old text says this happened." Historical storytelling often loses that distinction. A sensational story gets repeated. A newspaper repeats it. A website repeats the newspaper. A video repeats the website. And eventually, a rumor becomes historical fact. We should not do that. The surviving sources do give us evidence that the story existed. The Qing Dynasty account is particularly interesting because the author explicitly presents the story as something he initially considered exaggerated before claiming to have witnessed it. Another Qing-era literary source also contains a similar story. That means the practice was at least part of the historical lore surrounding the Qing treasury. But that does not automatically prove every detail. For example, claims about exactly how much silver could be hidden, how often it happened, how many workers participated, or how the technique was supposedly practiced should be treated cautiously. Some later popular accounts add increasingly elaborate details that are difficult to trace back to primary evidence. So the safest conclusion is this. The story of treasury workers hiding silver inside their bodies is documented in Qing-era literature. But the exact scale and frequency of the practice remain uncertain. And that uncertainty actually makes the story more interesting. Because now we have two stories. One is the story of the thieves. The other is the story of how historical rumors are created. There was a deeper problem behind all of this. You cannot completely eliminate theft when the people responsible for protecting the wealth are also surrounded by it every day. Locks can stop outsiders. Guards can stop intruders. But insiders are different. They already have access. The Qing treasury therefore had to rely on inspections, supervision, personnel rotation, and punishment. Yet every security measure created another challenge. If workers had to carry silver, someone had to watch them. If they had to change clothes, someone had to inspect them. If they used containers, someone had to examine the containers. And if they searched the body, the workers would look for places that were difficult or humiliating to inspect. The result was an endless struggle between bureaucracy and human ingenuity. And there was another side to this story. Stealing government property was not a harmless crime. Imperial China had severe punishments for theft and corruption involving state property. The people involved were not merely risking a lost job. They could face arrest, imprisonment, corporal punishment, and in serious cases, much harsher penalties. So why take the risk? Because corruption changes people's calculations. If someone believes that a small theft can make him rich and believes that everyone around him is already doing it, the risk can begin to look acceptable. This is how institutional corruption grows. Not because every person is evil, but because the system creates opportunities and people learn how to exploit them. That is why I think the strangest part of this story is not actually where the silver was hidden. The strangest part is what the story tells us about government. The Qing government built an elaborate system to protect its wealth. It had officials. It had guards. It had inspections. It had rules. It had punishments. And yet people still searched for loopholes. That is a lesson that appears throughout history. Whenever a system creates something valuable, someone eventually tries to exploit it. And whenever authorities close one loophole, someone looks for another. In this case, the loophole was almost unbelievably intimate. Think about the absurdity of the situation. The government had tried everything. No ordinary clothes. No pockets. No obvious containers. Physical inspections. Strict procedures. And yet the thieves allegedly discovered a hiding place that could not easily be detected. Not a secret compartment. Not a hidden box. Not a forged document. Their own bodies. It is one of those stories that makes you laugh at first. Then you realize someone had to be desperate enough to actually try it. And someone else had to be clever enough to think of it. And enough people had to know about it for the story to survive in written accounts. That is what makes it memorable. So, did Qing treasury guards really steal imperial silver by hiding it inside their bodies? The honest answer is, there is evidence that this story was recorded in Qing-era sources. But we should be cautious about treating every colorful detail as proven fact. What we can say with confidence is that treasury theft was a real concern, that the Qing government used strict procedures to prevent workers from carrying silver away, and that stories of workers defeating those inspections through extraordinary methods became part of the historical literature surrounding the treasury. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part, because history is not always about emperors sitting on golden thrones. Sometimes history is about ordinary workers standing at the exit of a government warehouse, while officials search them for stolen silver. Sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones that sound too strange to be true. And sometimes, the strangest stories survive because there was just enough truth behind them to make people remember. In the end, the Qing treasury had walls. It had guards. It had rules. It had inspections. But it had one weakness that no government can completely eliminate: human nature. And when there was silver on the other side of the door, some people were willing to do almost anything to get it out.